The snow crunched underfoot as 37,000 men, 9,000 horses, and 37 war elephants did the impossible. They scaled the towering Alps in winter. This wasn't just an invasion, it was a defiance of nature itself, a gamble that would either crown Hannibal as history's greatest tactician or bury him in the ice. What followed were 2 years of battles so shocking, so brutal, they rewrote the rules of warfare forever. From the Alps to the Trebia River, Hannibal outmaneuvered, outthought, and outraged Rome at every turn using flaming cattle charges, ambushes in blizzards, and psychological warfare that left the mighty Roman Republic trembling. These aren't just battles, they're masterclasses in strategy, desperation, and the raw will to survive. Strap in, you're about to witness the 30 most jaw-dropping moments of a campaign that still leaves historians speechless. Before the elephants marched and the Alps trembled under his army's feet, there was a boy just 9 years old, standing in a temple in Carthage, his small hand resting on the altar of a god. His father, Hamilcar Barca, hardened by defeat in the First Punic War, demanded an oath, not just any promise but a blood vow sworn on the very gods themselves. Young Hannibal pledged eternal hatred for Rome, sealing his destiny in that moment. Imagine the weight of such a promise carried not as a burden but as fuel. This wasn't just a grudge, it became the fire that would scorch Rome's legions for decades. The Barca family's rage wasn't born from mere rivalry. Carthage had been humiliated, stripped of Sicily, forced into crippling reparations after the war. Hamilcar, a brilliant general who'd never lost a battle in Sicily, had to watch his homeland kneel, and Hannibal, he inherited that bitterness like a second language spoken fluently in every decision he'd later make. When he crossed into Italy, it wasn't just about conquest, it was about vengeance meticulously planned down to the last spear thrown. What's chilling is how personal this war became. While Rome saw an empire's expansion, Hannibal fought with the intimacy of a blood feud. Every ambush, every psychological blow, like releasing captured Roman allies unharmed to sow distrust, was a calculated twist of the knife. His oath wasn't just a childhood pledge, it was the blueprint for chaos, and as we'll see, that single moment in the temple didn't just shape a man, it set the Mediterranean world on fire. Even the most battle-hardened Roman generals scoffed when reports reached them Hannibal wasn't just invading Italy, he was doing it through the frozen teeth of the Alps in winter. To call this reckless undersells the insanity of it. This wasn't merely dangerous, it was a death sentence for any normal army. Picture 37 war elephants plodding through knee-deep snow, their breath turning to ice in the thin mountain air. Men slipped from narrow paths into bottomless ravines. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, even lives as temperatures plunged beyond endurance. Yet Hannibal didn't just attempt the impossible, he weaponized it. The real shock wasn't just the crossing itself, but how he turned a logistical nightmare into psychological warfare. Rome's leaders had assumed the Alps were their unbreachable northern shield. No enemy in history had dared to scale those peaks in winter, let alone with an entire invasion force. When Hannibal's battered army finally emerged on the Italian side, half-starved and frostbitten but still fighting, it sent a chilling message. This man feared nothing, respected no rules, and would exploit every Roman assumption as a weakness. What's often overlooked is Hannibal's brilliance in managing the descent. The climb had been brutal, but going down icy slopes proved deadlier. Elephants, panicked by the steep drops, occasionally crushed their own handlers. Local tribes, bribed earlier to allow safe passage, now ambushed stragglers. Yet Hannibal adapted instantly, rerouting columns, sacrificing pack animals to clear paths, and even, according to one account, ordering soldiers to pour vinegar on frozen rock faces to weaken the ice. This wasn't just survival, it was a masterclass in crisis leadership. the Romans expected to fight battles in open fields, not nightmares on mountainsides. By the time Hannibal's diminished force reached the Po Valley, his reputation had already outpaced him. Stories spread of an invincible general who marched beasts over glaciers and turned blizzards into allies. The Alps had cost him nearly half his men, but the psychological blow to Rome was immeasurable. In that single, grueling crossing, Hannibal did more than surprise his enemy. He reshaped warfare itself, proving that audacity could rewrite the rules of geography. The moment Hannibal's surviving war elephants crashed onto the battlefield at Trebia, the rules of warfare in Europe changed forever. These weren't just animals, they were towering engines of terror, their sheer size and deafening roars enough to shatter Roman discipline. Picture a legionary trained to hold formation against swords and spears, suddenly staring up at a creature taller than two men, its tusks stained with the blood of his comrades. No amount of drills could prepare them for this. What made the elephants so devastating wasn't just their brute strength, but the way Hannibal wielded them like a surgeon's blade. He didn't simply unleash them head-on. He used them to manipulate Roman movements, herding entire units into kill zones where his cavalry and infantry waited. At Trebia, the surviving elephants, likely just a handful after the Alpine crossing, were strategically positioned to rupture the Roman flanks. The shock of their charge caused panic to ripple through the ranks, breaking formations that had stood firm against countless enemies before. The psychological impact went deeper than battlefield chaos. Roman commanders had studied Greek and Celtic tactics for generations, but this was something out of myth. The elephants became living symbols of Hannibal's otherworldly cunning, proof that he commanded forces beyond Rome's understanding. Even in their weakened state after the Alps, their mere presence forced the Romans to rethink everything. Legionaries who'd faced Gauls and Samnites now whispered about monsters from across the sea. Yet the real genius lay in Hannibal's adaptability. When blizzards struck during the battle, he turned the weather into another weapon, using the snow and cold to disorient his enemies further. By the time the elephants had done their work, the Romans weren't just outmaneuvered, they were demoralized, questioning whether any force could stop this man who bent nature itself to his will. It wasn't just a defeat for Rome that day, it was the birth of a legend, and Hannibal was just getting started. Rome had spent decades subduing the Gallic tribes of northern Italy, but their grip was never as firm as they believed. When Hannibal's battered army stumbled out of the Alps, half-starved and exhausted, he didn't just need food and shelter, he needed allies, and the Boii, a proud Celtic people who had suffered under Roman rule, saw their chance. For them, this wasn't treachery, it was justice long overdue. Their warriors didn't just join Hannibal, they brought something far more valuable than swords: intimate knowledge of the land, Roman fortifications, and the weak points in their defenses. The speed of this betrayal caught Rome completely off guard. One moment their northern frontier was secure, the next entire settlements were burning and supply lines were severed. The Boii didn't just fight alongside Hannibal, they incited uprisings among other tribes, turning what should have been a hostile invasion into a revolt from within. Imagine the panic in the Senate when reports arrived that the very people Rome had pacified were now guiding an enemy general through their own territory. Hannibal's genius wasn't just in winning battles, it was in exploiting Rome's blind spots. He understood that empires create resentments, and those resentments could be weapons. By allying with the Boii, he did more than add numbers to his army. He shattered the illusion of Roman control. This wasn't just a military campaign anymore, it was a rebellion, and suddenly Rome had to fight two wars, one against Hannibal and another against the people they thought they'd conquered. The most chilling detail, Hannibal didn't even need to persuade the Boii with grand promises. Their hatred for Rome was already a simmering fire. All he had to do was stoke it. When they watched his war elephants and battle-hardened veterans march into their lands, they didn't see an invader. They saw a liberator, and that shift in perception, more than any battle tactic, was what made Hannibal so terrifyingly effective. Rome had underestimated the depth of that grudges, and it would cost them dearly. The dense fog along the Ticinus River masked the approach of hooves, thousands of them, as Hannibal's Numidian cavalry closed in like shadows. This wasn't a traditional battle, it was a trap sprung with surgical precision. The Roman consuls had expected a probing skirmish, not the full fury of Hannibal's horsemen descending in a whirlwind of slashing swords and spears. Within moments, the orderly Roman lines dissolved into chaos, their formations collapsing under the weight of a force that moved faster than thought itself. What made Ticinus so devastating wasn't just the defeat, it was the humiliation. Consul Scipio, Rome's seasoned commander, found himself surrounded and wounded, his bodyguard cut down around him. Legend claims his own son, the future Scipio Africanus, charged into the fray to rescue him, a moment of bravery that foreshadowed Rome's eventual savior. But in that instant, the message was clear. Hannibal didn't just outfight the Romans, he outthought them at every turn. The real genius lay in Hannibal's deception. He'd lured Scipio into a false sense of security, using the river's terrain to funnel the Romans into a death trap. While Roman doctrine prized heavy infantry, Hannibal's lighter, faster cavalry danced around them, striking where they were weakest. It was a style of warfare Italy had never seen, fluid, unpredictable, and ruthlessly efficient. By the time the dust settled, the Romans weren't just retreating, they were re-evaluating everything they knew about war. Most alarming for Rome was the psychological aftermath. News of Ticinus spread like wildfire, shaking the Republic's confidence to its core. If their vaunted legions could be outmaneuvered so effortlessly, what hope did they have against the rest of Hannibal's army? This wasn't just a lost battle, it was a wake-up call. The invincibility of Rome's military machine had been cracked, and Hannibal was just getting started. Freezing water crept up the legs of Hannibal's hand-picked strike force as they crouched in the pre-dawn darkness, completely submerged beneath the Trebia's banks. Their breath fogged the icy air, muscles trembling not from fear, but from the brutal cold they endured without complaint. Across the river, the Roman legions stirred in their camps, unaware that the battlefield had already been chosen for them. Hannibal wasn't just planning a fight, he was staging a massacre. What made Trebia so devastating was the sheer audacity of the trap. The consul Sempronius, eager for glory after a minor cavalry skirmish, took the bait. He ordered his troops to cross the frigid river on empty stomachs, their bodies already weakened by cold and hunger. As the Roman infantry slogged through waist-deep currents, Hannibal's hidden troops erupted from their concealment, flanking them from behind while war elephants and cavalry hammered their front lines. The Romans weren't just outmaneuvered, they were caught in a killing box of Hannibal's design. The terrain itself became a weapon. Hannibal had studied the river's curves, knowing exactly where the current would slow the Roman advance. His cavalry, well-fed and rested, exploited every patch of muddy ground to destabilize their formations. Meanwhile, the freezing Romans struggled to even grip their weapons, their fingers numb and sluggish. By the time they realized the danger, escape routes had vanished beneath waves of Gallic warriors and Numidian horsemen, but the true horror lay in the aftermath. Those who survived the encirclement found themselves hunted through the winter landscape, cut down as they fled toward the river. The Trebia wasn't merely a defeat, it was Rome's first glimpse of Hannibal's signature tactic, turning confidence into catastrophe. And as the bodies piled up along the banks, one truth became undeniable. This wasn't just a general Rome was facing, it was a predator, and Italy itself had become his hunting ground. As blizzards howled across northern Italy, Hannibal's army should have collapsed. No other force could have endured what came next. While Roman generals assumed winter would force their enemy into retreat, Hannibal defied every expectation, not just surviving the brutal season, but bending it to his will. His men, wrapped in stolen Roman cloaks and scavenged Gallic furs, became ghosts haunting the countryside, appearing without warning to strip Roman granaries bare. Food wasn't the only resource he seized. Hannibal's scouts mapped every farm, every hidden valley where livestock could be taken. When supply lines stretched thin, he turned local resentment into an advantage, paying Celtic tribes in captured Roman silver for provisions. This wasn't mere pillaging, it was a calculated system, transforming occupied territory into a self-sustaining war machine. While Roman legions huddled in fortified camps waiting for spring, Hannibal's army kept moving, their very mobility a psychological blow. The coldest months revealed Hannibal's most underrated skill, leadership. Frostbite gnawed at fingers and toes, yet morale never broke. He shared every hardship, sleeping in the same rough camps as his lowest-ranking soldiers. When a detachment of Iberian troops threatened mutiny over the conditions, Hannibal didn't punish them. He addressed their grievances personally, redistributing blankets and food to prove their suffering mattered. That bond between commander and army became the glue holding everything together. Rome's shock wasn't just about survival tactics, it was the realization that Hannibal thrived on their assumptions. By refusing to retreat or seek winter quarters, he shattered the unspoken rules of Mediterranean warfare. Every raid, every mile marched through snowdrifts sent a deliberate message. This man played by no rules but his own. And as the Senate received reports of entire garrisons picked clean like carcasses by wolves, a new fear took root. Hannibal wasn't just winning battles. He was rewriting the very definition of war. Rome had not felt fear like this in generations. The Senate chamber, usually a place of calculated debate, erupted into frantic arguments as news arrived of Trebia's slaughter. For the first time in living memory, Rome's leaders faced an enemy who didn't just challenge their armies, he exposed their arrogance. In a desperate bid to restore order, they tore up their own playbook, suspending the Republic's cherished norms by appointing a dictator, Fabius Maximus. But even this extreme measure reeked of panic. The very title, dictator, was a confession Hannibal had forced Rome to its knees without even marching on the city. Fabius' strategy was as radical as the crisis demanded. He refused to meet Hannibal in open battle, instead shadowing his army like a ghost, harassing supply lines and avoiding direct confrontation. To the Roman elite, this was cowardice disguised as tactics. They mocked him as the delayer, sneering at his refusal to give them the glorious battle they craved. But Fabius understood something they refused to admit. Hannibal thrived on Roman impatience. Every pitched battle was a gift to him, another chance to exploit their overconfidence. The psychological toll was crushing. Hannibal's victories weren't just measured in dead legionaries, they were counted in the growing whispers across Italy. Allies began questioning Rome's invincibility. Tax collectors found doors barred where once they'd been welcomed. The Senate's desperation seeped into every decree, from doubling troop levies to stripping temples of gold to fund the war. Even their propaganda faltered. How could they boast of divine favor when Hannibal seemed blessed by the gods themselves? Most telling was the shift in Rome's own identity. This was a people who believed their discipline and tradition made them unbeatable. Now they watched as a foreign general outmaneuvered them at every turn, not with brute force, but by understanding them better than they understood themselves. Fabius' appointment wasn't just a military decision. It was a silent admission that Rome's greatest weakness wasn't its armies, but its pride. And Hannibal, the boy who'd sworn an oath decades earlier, was holding up a mirror they couldn't bear to face. The Roman Forum buzzed with furious whispers as senators clenched their fists in frustration. For centuries, their legions had crushed enemies through raw strength, and disciplined charges victory came from meeting foes head-on. But now, Fabius Maximus dared to suggest the unthinkable, refusing battle entirely. His strategy wasn't just unconventional. To proud Romans, it felt like cowardice. Shadowing Hannibal's army like a wolf stalking prey, Fabius burned crops, sabotaged supply routes, and vanished before retaliation could come. No glorious clashes, no pitched battles, just slow, methodical strangulation. What made this approach so controversial wasn't its effectiveness, but the cultural shock it delivered. Roman military tradition worshipped virtus, courage demonstrated through direct confrontation. By denying his troops the chance to fight, Fabius wasn't just challenging tactics, he was attacking their very identity. Soldiers grumbled about missed glory, while political rivals mocked him as cunctator, the delayer. Yet beneath the scorn lay a cold, uncomfortable truth. Fabius was the first Roman leader to truly respect Hannibal's brilliance. He recognized that every open battle played into the Carthaginians' hands. The real stroke of genius in Fabius' plan was its psychological subtlety. While Hannibal relied on luring Rome into traps, Fabius refused to take the bait. Instead, he turned time itself into a weapon. Each month Hannibal spent marching through Italy without a decisive victory eroded his aura of invincibility. Local allies, initially eager to defect, began hesitating. Meanwhile, Roman legions drilled relentlessly, adapting tactics to counter Hannibal's cavalry superiority. Fabius wasn't just delaying, he was resetting the chessboard. Yet the Senate's patience frayed like a worn rope. The people, fed on tales of ancestral valor, clamored for action. When Hannibal deliberately spared Fabius' private estates during raids, a masterful ploy to fuel suspicion, the backlash exploded. Accusations of treason swirled, and Fabius was stripped of his command. Rome would learn the hard way that abandoning his strategy came at a terrible price. In their hunger for quick triumph, they'd forgotten the wisdom of the tortoise against the hare. And Hannibal, ever the opportunist, was waiting to remind them. The streets of Rome bustled with merchants, slaves, and senators, utterly unaware that some among them were weaving invisible threads of betrayal. Hannibal's greatest weapon wasn't just his elephants or his cavalry. It was the whispers traveling through the city's markets, bathhouses, and even its sacred temples. While Roman generals obsessed over battlefield formations, Hannibal mastered a darker art. His spies weren't just watching, they were shaping the war itself. These weren't just scouts lurking in the countryside. His network included disgruntled merchants angry over Roman trade restrictions, Gallic slaves with ears in aristocratic households, and even disillusioned Italian allies who'd grown tired of Rome's heavy hand. They moved money, forged letters, and spread rumors like poison, sowing doubt about Rome's generals or fabricating threats of unrest to divert legions away from Hannibal's path. One intercepted report even described how they tampered with grain shipments, leaving key garrisons hungry and demoralized. What stunned the Romans most was the sheer audacity of it all. In their worldview, war was fought with honor, sword against sword, shield against shield. Hannibal played by no such rules. When a Roman patrol mysteriously vanished near Capua, it wasn't an ambush, it was a bribe. Local guides, paid in Carthaginian silver, had led them straight into a ravine. Even the Senate's own messengers couldn't be trusted. Some carried forged orders designed to create chaos. The psychological impact was devastating. Every Roman victory suddenly felt fragile, every defeat suspicious. Senators began eyeing their own servants with paranoia. Hannibal didn't just outmaneuver Rome's armies, he made them doubt their own people. And in that climate of fear, even the truth became a weapon. By the time the Romans realized the scale of his spy network, it was too late. The shadows had already done their work. Yet the darkest brilliance of Hannibal's espionage lay in its simplicity. He didn't need complex codes or secret societies, just human nature. Greed, resentment, and ambition did the work for him. And as Rome's leaders tore each other apart searching for traitors, Hannibal's real triumph wasn't in the battles he won, it was in the trust he destroyed. The fertile plains of Campania, once the breadbasket of Rome, now choked under columns of black smoke rising from burning orchards. Hannibal's army moved like a plague of locusts, methodical, unrelenting, and utterly merciless. This wasn't random destruction, it was economic warfare crafted with cold precision. Every granary torched, every vineyard uprooted, every well filled with carcasses was a deliberate strike at Rome's lifeline. The goal wasn't just to feed his own troops, but to starve the Republic into submission. What made Campania's devastation so chilling was its intimacy. Hannibal didn't just target military depots, he erased entire communities from the map. Farmers who'd supplied Rome for generations watched as their livelihoods vanished in flames. The message was unmistakable: no one was safe, and Rome's protection was an illusion. Even allies who'd secretly cheered his victories recoiled as the Carthaginian host left behind a wasteland where prosperous towns once stood. Yet there was twisted genius in this brutality. By ravaging Campania, Hannibal exploited Rome's greatest vulnerability, its reliance on conquered lands. The Senate could replace fallen soldiers, but empty stomachs in the city's slums bred something far more dangerous: panic. Grain prices skyrocketed, riots simmered in the streets, and for the first time, the war wasn't just a distant conflict but a knife at Rome's throat. The psychological toll cut deeper than the physical damage. Hannibal understood that wars are won in the mind long before they're decided on the battlefield. Each smoldering field was a taunt, proof that Rome couldn't defend its own heartland. And as the smoke blotted out the sun over Campania, even the most defiant senators began to wonder, how many more blows could their republic endure? Hannibal wasn't just fighting an army, he was dismantling an empire, one scorched acre at a time. The mist rising off Lake Trasimene that morning seemed almost peaceful until the echoing war horns shattered the silence. Roman consul Gaius Flaminius had marched his legions into a death trap, not realizing the entire hillside above them seethed with hidden Carthaginian warriors. By the time the first javelins rained down, it was too late. With their backs to the water and Hannibal's forces blocking every escape route, the Romans weren't just outmaneuvered, they were fish in a barrel. What made Trasimene so devastating wasn't merely the ambush, but its terrifying efficiency. Hannibal had spent days studying the terrain, noting how the morning fog clung to the lakeshore like a curtain. He positioned his troops in perfect silence, using the natural slope to amplify their charge. When they struck, the Romans couldn't even see their attackers, only the blurred shapes of death descending through the haze. Legionaries trampled each other in panic, some drowning in the shallows with their armor dragging them under. The numbers alone were staggering: 15,000 Romans dead in a single afternoon, compared to fewer than 2,000 Carthaginian losses. But the true horror lay in the aftermath. Hannibal ordered his men to search the carnage not for loot, but for Roman senators' bodies specifically to give them honorable burials. This wasn't respect, it was psychological warfare. By honoring the elite while leaving common soldiers to rot, he deepened the class resentment already festering in Rome. Rome's reaction to the disaster revealed just how deep the shock went. For the first time in centuries, the city appointed a dictator without debate, not to lead armies, but to perform desperate religious rites to appease the gods. The Senate openly questioned whether divine favor had abandoned them, and Hannibal, he didn't march on Rome as expected. He didn't need to. The real victory wasn't in the corpses floating in Trasimene's waters. It was in the cracks now spreading through Rome's unshakable confidence. One battle had turned their greatest strength, disciplined infantry, into a glaring weakness, and Hannibal was already planning how to exploit it again. The road to Lake Trasimene had been lined with Omen's broken bird wings on the march, a startled horse throwing Flaminius into the mud, but the consul spat at superstition. Rome didn't need signs from the gods, it needed action. Even as scouts whispered of Carthaginian forces shadowing his flanks, Flaminius scoffed. He'd chased Hannibal's phantom army across half of Italy, only to find empty camps and cold fires. This time, he swore, there would be no hesitation. The irony was cruel. In his rush to avoid being tricked, Flaminius played directly into Hannibal's hands. What's chilling about this catastrophe isn't just the ambush. It's how perfectly Hannibal exploited Roman psychology. He knew Flaminius was desperate to prove himself after Fabius' cautious strategies were mocked as cowardice. So he dangled the bait, burning villages just ahead, tempting the consul with an easy target. Every Roman instinct screamed to attack, honor demanded it. But those instincts had been carefully manipulated. Hannibal didn't just set a trap, he made Flaminius want to walk into it. The morning of the battle unfolded like a nightmare. Thick fog rolled off the lake, swallowing sound and sight. Legionaries marching in tight formation suddenly heard screams to their left. Then their right. Hannibal's forces were everywhere and nowhere. With the lake at their backs, escape was impossible. The killing lasted hours, not because the Romans fought well, but because they had nowhere to die except on each other's swords. Flaminius himself fell early, cut down by a Gaulish mercenary who likely never knew the magnitude of his kill. In the aftermath, Rome faced an uncomfortable truth. Their greatest enemy wasn't Hannibal's army, but their own toxic leadership culture. Flaminius hadn't ignored warnings because he was foolish. He ignored them because Roman society rewarded aggression and punished caution. The Senate, for all its grandeur, had created a system where recklessness was mistaken for bravery. As bodies washed ashore at Trasimene, even the most hawkish senators fell silent. The lesson was etched in blood. Pride wasn't just a sin against the gods. It was a death warrant, yet Hannibal's brilliance lay in what he didn't do next. While Rome braced for a march on the city, he turned south not to conquer but to dismantle. Trasimene hadn't been about breaking Rome's walls, it was about breaking their spirit, and as news of the disaster spread, something shifted in the Italian countryside. Allies who'd stayed loyal through earlier defeats now hesitated. The unthinkable was becoming plausible. Maybe Rome could fall, and that creeping doubt, more than any battlefield victory, was Hannibal's real triumph. The dust had barely settled at Lake Trasimene when Hannibal's envoys appeared at Rome's gates, not with demands, but with an offer of peace. To the bloodied republic, still reeling from 15,000 dead, it should have been a lifeline. Yet the terms carried a venomous subtlety. Hannibal proposed leniency, asking only for Rome's withdrawal from recently conquered territories, no reparations. No surrender, just an end to the slaughter. On the surface, it was magnanimous. In reality, it was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. What made this offer so dangerous wasn't its content, but its unspoken purpose. Hannibal understood Rome better than Rome understood itself. The Republic's identity was built on never negotiating under threat, especially not from a general camped on Italian soil. By posing as the reasonable party, he flipped the script. Now, any refusal would paint Rome as the aggressor, stubbornly clinging to empire at the cost of its people's blood. Allies watching from across Italy took note. The Senate's reaction was predictably furious, but their defiance came at a cost. Rejecting the proposal outright played straight into Hannibal's narrative. While senators spat about honor and tradition, their own citizens whispered, "Why not talk?" For the first time, cracks appeared in Rome's united front. Hannibal's envoys left unharmed another calculated move. Had he truly wanted peace, the terms would have been harsher. Had Rome truly believed in victory, they might have executed the messengers. Instead, both sides performed a pantomime of diplomacy, each knowing war would rage on. Behind the scenes, the maneuver achieved something even more insidious. It exposed Rome's strategic paralysis. Accepting terms meant admitting defeat. Rejecting them prolonged a war they were losing. Hannibal's brilliance lay in forcing that impossible choice. Meanwhile, his Gallic allies saw proof of Roman intransigence, and his troops, exhausted but emboldened, witnessed their general outmaneuvering the enemy without drawing a sword. This wasn't just politics, it was warfare refined to its purest form, a battle fought in the minds of men. Every senator's bluster, every nervous glance exchanged in the forum, fed Hannibal's real objective, eroding faith in Rome's leadership. And as the envoys rode back to camp, carrying the Republic's defiant rejection, they also carried something far more valuable, confirmation that Rome still didn't grasp it wasn't fighting an invasion. It was fighting a revolution. The air in Rome's Senate House turned thick with panic as riders galloped in with unthinkable news. Hannibal's army had broken camp and was marching straight toward the city. No enemy had threatened the capital in living memory, and now the man who'd butchered legion after legion was just days away. Streets once buzzing with commerce emptied as citizens barricaded doors, while senators debated desperate measures, stripping temples of gold to fund defenses, even arming slaves. A taboo last resorted to during the darkest days of the Republic. The unshakable heart of an empire was gripped by pure terror. What made this advance so brilliant wasn't its military feasibility. Hannibal knew sieging Rome's massive walls without proper equipment was suicide. It was the psychological earthquake he triggered with a single maneuver. By feigning a direct assault, he exposed Rome's deepest insecurity, the illusion of invulnerability. The Senate's frantic reactions betrayed them. Recalled legions abandoned strategic positions elsewhere in Italy, scrambling to defend a city that wasn't even under attack yet. Hannibal didn't need to breach the gates, he'd already infiltrated their minds. The real masterstroke lay in timing. He advanced just as fresh Roman legions mobilized for a counteroffensive, forcing them to abandon their plans and rush home. Crops stood unharvested in Campania because farmers fled to the city, unknowingly aiding Hannibal's scorched earth strategy. Even the geography played into his hands. His route passed the ruins of Veii, Rome's ancient rival, a ghostly reminder of what happened to cities that underestimated their enemies. Every mile marched was a theater of intimidation, yet the most revealing moment came when Hannibal abruptly halted his advance, then withdrew. The message couldn't have been clearer. This was never about conquest. It was about control. By demonstrating he could make Rome dance to his tune, he shattered the myth of Roman inevitability. Allies watching from across Italy saw the mighty Republic flinch. Grain shipments stalled, trade routes withered, and whispers spread. If Rome couldn't protect itself, how could it protect anyone else? The scars of that feigned march lingered long after Hannibal's army faded back into the countryside. For centuries, Roman strategy had been dictated by one question: what do we want to take? Now, for the first time, they were forced to ask, what might we lose? And in that shift, Hannibal achieved something no battlefield victory could. He turned an empire into prey. The forests around Geronium seemed peaceful, until the snapping of branches betrayed Hannibal's cavalry sweeping in like a sudden storm. Fabius Maximus, Rome's cautious dictator, had grown too comfortable shadowing the Carthaginian army from a distance. Now, in a heartbeat, his own strategy became his greatest vulnerability. Isolated on a scouting mission with only a handful of guards, Fabius found himself staring down Numidian horsemen closing in from all sides. This wasn't just an ambush, it was a personal challenge hurled at Rome's most revered strategist. Hannibal's brilliance shone in the details of this near capture. He hadn't just stumbled upon Fabius, he'd spent weeks studying the Romans' routines, noting how his confidence grew with each uneventful day. The raid was meticulously timed to coincide with a moment of lowered vigilance, exploiting the very predictability Fabius prided himself on avoiding. For a man who'd built his reputation on patience and foresight, the humiliation was unbearable. The shockwaves reached Rome before Fabius even returned to camp. If the shield of Rome could be cornered like a common scout, what did that mean for lesser commanders? Senators who'd grudgingly accepted Fabius' delaying tactics now seized on the incident as proof of their weakness. The irony was brutal. The one general who truly understood Hannibal's genius was being pressured to abandon the only strategy that had worked, all because of pride. What followed was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Hannibal didn't need to kill Fabius. Letting him escape served a darker purpose. The close call shattered the dictator's aura of invincibility, emboldening his critics. Within weeks, Fabius was forced to share command with the aggressive Minucius, a man who openly mocked his caution. The Carthaginian general hadn't just outmaneuvered Rome's best tactician, he'd turned Rome's own political divisions into weapons. By the time Fabius relinquished his dictatorship, the damage was done. The Senate, desperate for a quick end to the war, began demanding the very thing Hannibal craved, a decisive battle. In one daring raid, he'd not only exposed Roman arrogance but also manipulated them into abandoning their sole advantage. The trap wasn't set on the battlefield, it was woven into the fabric of Roman pride itself. And now, with Fabius sidelined, the stage was set for Hannibal's deadliest masterpiece yet. The plains of Cannae baked under the August sun as 80,000 Roman legionaries marched forward, their bronze armor glinting like a deadly river flowing toward Hannibal's outnumbered forces. The Senate had demanded battle, and the new consuls Varro and Paulus were eager to deliver it. Confidence ran so high that some officers brought chains to shackle prisoners before the fighting even began. What followed wasn't just a defeat, it was a masterpiece of annihilation, a tactical symphony orchestrated by Hannibal to perfection. Hannibal's genius lay in making the Romans believe they were winning. He arranged his center, a mix of Gallic and Iberian infantry, in a deliberate crescent weak enough to buckle under the Roman advance. As the legions pushed forward, drunk on false victory, they didn't realize they were walking into a carefully constructed killing field. Meanwhile, Hannibal's elite African veterans, positioned on the flanks, stood motionless as the Roman tide rushed past them. The trap was set before the first sword had even clashed. Then came the hammer blow. At Hannibal's signal, those silent African troops pivoted inward like closing jaws, while his cavalry, having shattered their Roman counterparts, wheeled around to slam into the rear. In an instant, the mighty Roman army found itself encircled, packed so tightly that men couldn't even raise their weapons. The slaughter that followed defied imagination. Soldiers suffocated in the crush, trampled by their own comrades. Hannibal's cavalry rode along the edges, spearing trapped legionaries like fish in a barrel. The dusty plains turned to mud with blood. The numbers alone still stagger historians. Over 50,000 Romans dead in a single afternoon. Entire aristocratic families were wiped out in hours. The consul Paulus fell alongside dozens of senators who joined the battle for glory. Those who survived did so only by hiding beneath piles of corpses, waiting for nightfall to escape. When news reached Rome, the city descended into hysterical grief. Women wailed in the streets, and the Senate debated desperate measures, even human sacrifice, to appease the gods. Yet Cannae's true impact wasn't just the bloodshed, it was the psychological earthquake that followed. Hannibal had proven that Rome's vaunted legions weren't just beatable, they could be erased from existence. Allies across Italy defected overnight, believing the Republic was finished. Even Carthage, slow to support Hannibal before, now saw victory as inevitable. But in a twist of irony, Cannae also revealed Hannibal's fatal weakness. He didn't just defeat Rome that day, he humiliated them too deeply to ever consider surrender. The very scale of his triumph ensured Rome would fight to the last breath rather than yield. Historians still study Cannae as the pinnacle of battlefield tactics, but its real lesson is darker. Sometimes winning too completely can be worse than losing. Hannibal broke every rule of war that day except the one that mattered most. No army, no matter how brilliant, can conquer a people who refuse to stop fighting. And Rome, bleeding but unbowed, was just beginning to show what that meant. Rome's consuls, Paulus and Varro, stood on opposite ends of the battlefield and the spectrum of military wisdom. Paulus, a seasoned veteran, urged caution, knowing Hannibal's reputation for turning Roman aggression into carnage. Varro, a brash populist, scoffed at hesitation. Their fatal disagreement wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was Rome's rigid leadership system cracking under pressure. Unlike Hannibal, who commanded absolute authority, Roman armies alternated daily command between consuls. One day, prudence dictated their moves, the next, recklessness led the charge. At Cannae, that lethal pendulum swung too far. Varro's fatal miscalculation wasn't ignorance, it was arrogance. Convinced sheer numbers would crush Hannibal, he ordered a full frontal assault the moment his turn came, dismissing Paulus' warnings as cowardice. Even the battle's geography played into Hannibal's hands. Varro chose dusty, open plains that nullified Rome's infantry discipline while giving Carthaginian cavalry free rein. As the trap closed, Paulus, recognizing disaster, refused to flee. Witnesses later told of him dismounting to stand with doomed legionaries, sword in hand, choosing death over dishonor, a final rebuke to his colleagues' hubris. Varro's survival became its own kind of punishment. The few senators who escaped Cannae brought tales of his frantic retreat, abandoning 50,000 men to their fate. Yet what stung Rome most wasn't his cowardice, it was their own complicity. The Senate had appointed these polar opposites, betting political balance outweighed military competence. When they later thanked Varro for not despairing of the Republic, the gesture reeked of hollow protocol. The truth, Hannibal hadn't just defeated two men, he'd exposed a system that valued rivalry over unity. The aftermath revealed an uncomfortable pattern. While Varro became a scapegoat, Rome quietly reformed its commands, allowing longer terms for proven leaders like Scipio. Hannibal's true victory lay in forcing his enemies to evolve. Yet even in failure, the consul's legacy held a grim lesson. Against a mind like Hannibal's, division was deadlier than any sword. And Rome, humbled but not broken, would take that warning to heart. The battlefield at Cannae still reeked of death when Hannibal made his most surprising move, yet he gathered thousands of Roman prisoners and set them free. Not in secret, not for ransom, but openly, with one simple condition. They must return to Rome and describe what they'd witnessed. This wasn't mercy, it was psychological warfare distilled to its purest form. While Rome's Senate expected chains or slavery, Hannibal gave them something far more dangerous, living witnesses to their own humiliation. What made this gesture so devastating was its calculated cruelty. Each freed soldier became a walking, talking wound in Rome's collective psyche. They carried home not just stories of defeat, but intimate details: how Hannibal's cavalry had circled them like wolves, how their formations collapsed under the weight of their own numbers, how the rivers ran red for days. These weren't battlefield rumors anymore, they were first-hand accounts no propaganda could erase. The Senate couldn't spin the truth when it sat weeping in their own streets. Hannibal's genius lay in exploiting an unspoken Roman vulnerability, their obsession with reputation. By letting prisoners go unharmed, he positioned himself not as a barbarian but as a magnanimous victor, a subtle twist of the knife that made Rome's refusal to negotiate seem stubborn rather than noble. Even worse, his mercy forced the Republic to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their soldiers might prefer Carthaginian captivity to death for Rome, since Hannibal treated his prisoners better than Roman law required. The ripple effects reached far beyond the battlefield. Markets hushed as ragged survivors limped through city gates. Mothers clutched sons who'd fought beside men now buried in mass graves. Senators who dismissed earlier defeats as flukes now faced a populace drowning in visceral, undeniable horror. Hannibal didn't need to attack Rome's walls. He'd infiltrated its homes, its dinner tables, its nightmares. Yet the cruelest twist wasn't the prisoners' release, it was their reception. Rome, ever proud, refused to ransom those captured at Cannae, branding them cowards unworthy of rescue. Hannibal hadn't just shattered Roman military pride, he'd exposed the hypocrisy festering beneath it. These men, once honored legionaries, now wandered the Republic as ghosts, living proof that Rome's greatest enemy wasn't across the battlefield. He was in the mirror. The gates of Capua swung open not to invaders, but to cheer's wealthiest of Rome's allies was embracing Hannibal as a liberator. This wasn't just a city changing sides, it was a seismic crack in the foundation of Roman Italy. For generations, Capua had been a jewel in Rome's crown, its artisans crafting the finest weapons, its fertile fields feeding legions. Now, those same hands raised cups in toast to their former oppressor's downfall. Hannibal's triumph here went far beyond military strategy. Where Rome ruled through force and tribute, he offered something subtler: respect. Capuan nobles, tired of playing second fiddle to Roman senators, were seduced not by threats but by promises of autonomy. Hannibal didn't demand troops or gold, he simply let Capua govern itself, a tantalizing taste of freedom after decades under Rome's heavy boot. The psychological impact rippled across Italy. If mighty Capua could defect, who else might dare? Rome's reaction bordered on hysterical. The Senate had weathered battlefield losses, but this was existential. Capua's betrayal exposed the rot they'd long ignored. Their so-called allies were hostages, not partners. Desperate measures followed, from seizing Capuan property in Rome to publicly torturing defectors. Yet the harder Rome squeezed, the more cities wondered if Hannibal's leniency might be the safer bet. What's often overlooked is how shrewdly Hannibal leveraged this victory. He wintered in Capua's luxury, yes, but more importantly, he broadcast it. Let Rome see their richest ally housing the enemy in villas warmed by Campanian sunshine. Let them imagine the whispers in banquet halls where Roman patronage once reigned. This wasn't just comfort, it was theater. Each opulent feast a deliberate middle finger to the austerity of the Senate. Yet for all its brilliance, Capua's defection carried the seeds of Hannibal's eventual undoing. By indulging his troops in the city's pleasures, he dulled their edge, a mistake Rome would exploit. And those very nobles who welcomed him, their loyalty proved as fickle as their fortunes. But in that pivotal moment, as Capua's gates closed behind him, Hannibal had achieved the unthinkable. He'd turned Rome's own empire against itself. The streets of Nola echoed with an unfamiliar sound Roman cheers. After years of humiliating defeats, General Marcellus had done the impossible. He'd stood his ground against Hannibal and won. It wasn't a grand, sweeping victory, no elephants fleeing in panic, no rivers choked with enemy dead. But for a Rome starved of hope, this modest triumph tasted sweeter than any feast. Marcellus' secret, he'd learned from Hannibal's own playbook, using the city's narrow streets to neutralize Carthaginian cavalry and turning Nola's walls into a killing ground. Yet Hannibal's response revealed just how dangerous he truly was. Instead of stubbornly throwing more troops at Nola, he simply walked away. This wasn't retreat, it was recalibration. While Rome toasted their first victory in years, Hannibal was already scouting richer targets, proving that his greatest strength wasn't winning battles, it was refusing to play by Rome's rules. The man who'd crossed the Alps in winter wouldn't waste lives on a fortified hill town when Italy's soft underbelly lay exposed. Marcellus' win did something unexpected, though. It cracked Hannibal's aura of invincibility. For the first time, local allies hesitated to defect. If Rome could bleed the undefeatable general, maybe clinging to the Republic wasn't suicide after all. But the celebration masked a grim reality. Nola hadn't broken Hannibal's army, just his momentum. And momentum, as Rome would soon learn, was a luxury in short supply when facing a commander who treated every setback as a chance to pivot. The true lesson of Nola wasn't in the battle itself, but in what followed. Marcellus earned the nickname Sword of Rome, yet his tactics relied more on patience than brute force, waiting for Hannibal to overextend, then striking with surgical precision. Meanwhile, Hannibal's withdrawal wasn't admission of defeat, it was a cold calculation. Why waste time storming a city when he could ravage the countryside, starving Rome's allies into submission? The war had entered a new phase, one where even Rome's victories came with hidden costs. The Meteorus River ran red with the blood of Carthage's last hope. Hasdrubal Barca, Hannibal's own brother, had spent years fighting his way across Spain and Gaul, only to meet catastrophe at the hands of a Roman ambush. His severed head, flung into Hannibal's camp like a grisly parcel, wasn't just a trophy. It was Rome's merciless declaration: no help was coming. After over a decade of fighting alone on foreign soil, Hannibal's lifeline had been cut with a single, brutal stroke. What made this defeat so devastating wasn't just the loss of men. It was the precision of Rome's revenge. Hasdrubal's messengers had been intercepted, his plans laid bare. The Romans didn't just block his path to Hannibal, they annihilated his entire army, leaving no survivors to carry word. When the ghastly package finally arrived, Hannibal reportedly stared at his brother's features, still recognizable despite decay, and murmured, "There lies the fate of Carthage." In that moment, he understood the truth. Rome had learned to fight like him. The Meteorus disaster revealed a cruel irony. Hasdrubal's tactics mirrored Hannibal's early brilliance, daring river crossings, rapid marches, but Rome was no longer the overconfident foe of Cannae. They'd adapted, using spies and scouts to track his every move. The consul Nero, in a stroke of ruthless genius, diverted troops from southern Italy without Hannibal noticing, ensuring Hasdrubal faced overwhelming force. For the first time, Carthage was outmaneuvered on the strategic level, not just the battlefield. Yet the deepest wound was psychological. Hannibal had spent years waiting, conserving his dwindling forces, certain that reinforcements would tip the scales. Now, with his brother's lifeless gaze staring up from the dirt, that faith shattered. His veterans, many who'd crossed the Alps as young men, exchanged haunted glances. How much longer could they hold out? The Meteorus wasn't just a lost battle. It was the moment Rome proved it could bleed the Barca family itself, and still Hannibal fought on. With no fresh troops, no allies left to rally, and Rome's noose tightening, his campaign became something darker. Not a war of conquest, but of stubborn defiance. The tide had turned indeed. But the man who'd once made empires tremble wasn't done making them pay for every step. The Roman Senate was still reeling from Cannae's catastrophe when an unlikely figure stepped forward: 25-year-old Publius Cornelius Scipio. The same Scipio who had pulled his wounded father from the Ticinus disaster now stood before Rome's elders with audacious plans for Spain. While older generals clung to traditional tactics, this young aristocrat grasped a revolutionary truth. To defeat Hannibal, Rome needed to become Hannibal. What set Scipio apart wasn't just his battlefield courage, it was his intellectual curiosity. Where others saw Carthaginian trickery as cowardice, he recognized artistry. Witnessing Hannibal's ambushes firsthand had imprinted on him like a gruesome apprenticeship. Now in Spain, he moved with eerie familiarity, hijacking Hannibal's own playbook. Swift night marches mimicked the Trebia approach, feigned retreats echoed Lake Trasimene's deadly ruse, but Scipio added something new: Roman discipline layered over Carthaginian cunning. His campaign to sack New Carthage was a masterpiece of asymmetric warfare. While Hannibal starved Rome's allies in Italy, Scipio struck at the lifeline keeping Carthage's war machine alive: Spanish silver mines and supply routes. The gamble paid off spectacularly. With Spain under Roman control, Hannibal's veterans, already stretched thin after 13 years of campaigning, found reinforcements and funding evaporating. What terrified Carthage's ruling elite wasn't the loss of territory, but the dawning realization that Rome now possessed its own military prodigy. Scipio didn't just defeat Carthaginian armies, he turned their allies, employing Hannibal's diplomacy tactics with brutal efficiency. Spanish chieftains who once supplied Hannibal with troops now pledged loyalty to Rome, swayed by Scipio's blend of respect and ruthlessness. Yet the true genius of Scipio's rise lay in its timing. While Hannibal remained bogged down in southern Italy, his young nemesis was dismantling the very foundation of Carthaginian power abroad. The student had not only matched the master, he was poised to surpass him. And as Roman ships laden with Spanish silver sailed toward Italy, the balance of the war began its inexorable shift. For the first time since the Alps, Hannibal wasn't the predator. He was the prey. The dusty plains of Zama simmered under the North African sun as two titans of war faced each other for the first and last time: Hannibal, the legendary scourge of Rome, and Scipio, the young general who had studied his every move. This wasn't just another battle, it was a collision of fates where the student would finally test himself against the master. And in a cruel twist of irony, Scipio's greatest weapon was Hannibal's own playbook. Hannibal's army stood unlike any he'd commanded before. Gone were the battle-hardened veterans who'd crossed the Alps with him. In their place stood freshly levied Carthaginian troops, war elephants hastily brought to the field, and mercenaries with little loyalty. Even his vaunted cavalry, the force that had decided so many victories, was outmatched by Scipio's Numidian allies, riders who knew the terrain better than their Carthaginian foes. The imbalance was stark. Hannibal's genius remained, but the tools of his trade had dulled. Scipio, meanwhile, had spent years preparing for this moment. He didn't just mimic Hannibal's tactics, he refined them. When Hannibal unleashed his elephants in a desperate opening charge, Scipio's legions parted like water, funneling the beasts harmlessly through gaps in their lines. Trumpets blared, signaling hidden trapdoors where Roman velites hurled javelins into the elephants' flanks, turning them into panicked liabilities that trampled their own troops. It was a maneuver Hannibal himself might have devised, only now it was being used against him. The battle's climax came not in a dramatic clash of infantry, but in a meticulous unraveling. Scipio's cavalry, after routing their Carthaginian counterparts, wheeled back to strike Hannibal's rear, just as Hannibal had done at Cannae. The symmetry was brutal. Trapped between disciplined Roman lines and the returning horsemen, Carthage's army collapsed. Hannibal, ever the pragmatist, fled the field rather than die in a futile last stand. The man who had once made Rome tremble now rode away from his first and only defeat, not as a broken legend, but as a general who knew when the tide had turned. News of Zama sent shockwaves across the Mediterranean. To Rome, it was vindication proof that they could not only survive Hannibal but outthink him. To Carthage, it was the death knell of an empire. But the real legacy of Zama wasn't just in who won or lost. It was in the bitter lesson Hannibal himself had taught Rome years earlier: adaptability wins wars. Scipio hadn't triumphed by brute force. He'd won by becoming everything Rome once feared, and in doing so, he ended the career of history's greatest tactical mind. The final chapters of Hannibal's life read like a tragic epic, one where the hero's brilliance couldn't outpace the relentless machinery of Rome's vengeance. After Zama, the general who once dictated terms to the Republic became a fugitive, trading his war elephants for the shadowy halls of foreign courts. Carthage, desperate to appease Rome, exiled their own savior, but Hannibal refused to fade quietly into history. Instead, he reinvented himself as a mercenary commander and strategist, offering his genius to anyone willing to defy Rome's growing dominance. From the glittering palaces of Seleucid kings to the rugged highlands of Armenia, Hannibal's mind remained as sharp as ever. He designed harbors for Antiochus Roman III, plotted campaigns against Roman allies, and even allegedly scribbled battle plans for Bithynia's king, each move a silent rebellion against the empire that had hounded him for decades. Rome, unable to rest while he breathed, dispatched envoys and assassins with one demand: surrender the man they still called the Terror of Italy. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Hannibal, who'd once marched elephants through blizzards, now found himself cornered in a petty dispute between minor monarchs. When Roman agents finally closed in on him in Bithynia, the old general chose his exit with characteristic defiance. Poison, not the sword, was his final weapon, a last act of control denying Rome the satisfaction of capturing or killing him. Legend claims his dying words were, "Let us relieve the Romans of their fear." Yet Rome's obsession with Hannibal outlived the man himself. They vilified him in histories, burned his treatises, and erased his victories from official records, all while secretly studying his tactics for generations. The boy who'd sworn an oath over an altar died hunted and alone, but his ghost lingered in every Roman general's nightmare, every whispered strategy session. Even in death, Hannibal won a perverse victory. He became the monster under Rome's bed, the standard against which all enemies were measured. And so the man who'd reshaped warfare, humbled an empire, and walked the Alps as if they were mere hills met his end not on a battlefield, but in a borrowed villa far from home. No grand tomb, no state funeral, just the quiet closing of a life too large for any one nation to contain. But history never forgets true greatness. Long after Carthage's ashes cooled, Hannibal's name still sent shivers down the spines of those who'd never seen an elephant or heard a war horn blow. That, perhaps, was his most enduring triumph of all. The flames that consumed Carthage in 146 BC burned hotter than mere fire. They were fueled by 3 generations of Roman terror. Decades after Hannibal's defeat, the Republic returned to Carthage not as conquerors but as exterminators. For 17 days, the city that once rivaled Rome's grandeur was systematically dismantled stone by stone, street by street, until only ashes and echoes remained. Even the earth itself was cursed, sown with salt to mock the myth of rebirth. This wasn't just victory, it was catharsis for a trauma Rome could never outgrow. What's chilling about Carthage's destruction isn't the brutality, but the lingering fear it exposed. By 149 BC, Carthage was already a shadow. Its navy scuttled, its territories carved away, its people forbidden even to wage war without Roman permission. Yet when enraged senators like Cotto the Elder kept demanding Carthage must be destroyed, they weren't reacting to a military threat, they were exorcising Hannibal's ghost. The man himself had been dead for 40 years, but the specter of his invasion, the elephants at the gates, the corpses at Cannae, still haunted Rome's collective psyche. The siege revealed a dark irony. Carthage, stripped of power, fought with desperate ingenuity, melting down temple gold for weapons, fashioning swords from farm tools, even weaving armor from women's hair. In another era, such resilience might have earned respect. Instead, it only deepened Rome's resolve. When legions finally breached the last defenses, the slaughter was indiscriminate. Ancient sources claim 50,000 survivors were sold into slavery, while the city's libraries, centuries of Phoenician knowledge, burned alongside homes. In erasing Carthage, Rome wasn't just eradicating a rival, it was trying to rewrite history itself, yet Hannibal's fingerprints proved impossible to scrub away. Even as Carthage crumbled, his tactics were being adopted by the very generals who destroyed it. Scipio Aemilianus, the commander overseeing the siege, had studied Hannibal's campaigns meticulously. Rome's obsession with obliterating every trace of Carthage only cemented his legacy because true influence isn't measured in stones left standing, but in ideas that outlive empires. The tragedy lingers in the silence of modern-day Tunisia, where Carthage's ruins now lie beneath olive groves and tourist cafes. No plaques mark the spots where Hannibal once walked. No grand monuments celebrate his defiance. But dig a little deeper and you'll find the real memorial. Every Roman road, every legionary formation, every whisper of strategy in military academies still bears the imprint of the man who taught Rome the price of arrogance. They salted the earth, but the lesson took root anyway. Hannibal's legacy, the father of strategy, centuries fade, empires rise and fall, but true genius refuses to be forgotten. Hannibal's name didn't just echo through the ancient world, it reverberated across millennia, becoming the gold standard for military mastery. Long after Carthage's ruins cooled, commanders from Napoleon to Patton would keep his campaigns on their desks, dissecting his every move like sacred texts. What made his tactics timeless wasn't just their effectiveness, it was their daring creativity. Take the double envelopment at Cannae, a maneuver so flawless it's still taught in war colleges today. Hannibal didn't just defeat the Roman army, he orchestrated its annihilation by luring it into a carefully constructed kill zone, then closing the jaws of his forces from all sides. Modern generals still speak of the Cannae ideal, the perfect battle of encirclement, because no one has ever executed it more devastatingly. Yet his genius extended far beyond battlefield formations. The Alpine crossing alone rewrote the rules of what was possible in war. Where others saw impassable mountains, Hannibal saw opportunity, a path so unimaginable that Rome left it undefended. That audacity became his trademark, inspiring future leaders to defy conventional limits. Napoleon himself later mirrored the feat, leading troops over the Alps in a deliberate nod to Hannibal's legend. Perhaps most revolutionary was his use of psychological warfare. Long before modern propaganda, Hannibal understood that battles are won in the mind before they're fought on the ground. By releasing Roman prisoners, sparing certain allies, and even timing his attacks for maximum terror, he weaponized perception itself. Patton would later employ similar mind games in World War II, using feints and theatrics to unnerve his enemies. But Hannibal's ultimate legacy isn't just in the tactics he pioneered, it's in the way he forced his enemies to evolve. Rome emerged from its war with Carthage fundamentally changed, adopting elements of his adaptability and mobility. In a strange twist, the Republic's greatest rival became its most influential teacher. Today, his name remains shorthand for strategic brilliance, a reminder that the best commanders don't just follow the rules, they rewrite them. And in lecture halls, war rooms, and history books, Hannibal's shadow still looms large, proving that true mastery doesn't fade. It inspires. Why Hannibal's greatest gamble never happened, that moment still baffles historians. The day Hannibal stood just miles from Rome's walls, victory within reach, yet chose not to strike. After Cannae, with the Republic reeling and its armies shattered, the path to Rome lay open. So why didn't he march? The answer reveals the tragic cracks in his otherwise flawless strategy. Some argue siege engines were his downfall. Without the heavy equipment needed to breach Rome's massive fortifications, an assault could have bogged down into a bloody stalemate. Others point to his dwindling troops after years of campaigning. Even his veterans were exhausted, but the deeper truth lies in Hannibal's own calculations. He didn't just want to defeat Rome, he wanted to break it psychologically, and that required something far more elusive than a military victory. His gamble hinged on Rome's allies abandoning her. If enough Italian cities defected, the Republic would collapse from within. Yet here, Hannibal misread his enemy. Rome's alliances weren't built on loyalty alone, they were reinforced by sheer pragmatism. Even after Cannae, many cities hesitated, realizing that swapping Roman rule for Carthaginian promises might only trade one master for another. Without their revolt, Hannibal's army lacked the local support to sustain a prolonged siege. Meanwhile, Rome played the long game with ruthless efficiency. They avoided pitched battles, harassed supply lines, and most critically, never lost faith. While Hannibal waited for their spirit to crack, the Senate raised fresh legions, tightened alliances, and turned the countryside into a wasteland, starving his army of resources. Every month that passed eroded his advantage, until the once unstoppable general found himself trapped in a war of attrition he couldn't win. The bitter irony. Hannibal's very brilliance became his undoing. He'd spent years outmaneuvering Rome tactically, only to underestimate its strategic endurance. His genius lay in winning battles, but Rome mastered something far more powerful: the will to keep fighting, no matter the cost. By the time Carthage finally sent reinforcements, it was too little, too late. Rome had already adapted, while Hannibal remained frozen in the shadow of his own early triumphs. In the end, his greatest flaw wasn't a lack of skill, but a misjudgment of his enemy's resilience. The boy who swore eternal hatred against Rome never grasped one simple truth: some foes, when cornered, don't surrender. They transform. Modern parallels. Why Hannibal's war manual still matters. Think of history's greatest strategists not as relics of the past, but as timeless mentors. And Hannibal's playbook reads like a masterclass in disruption. The same tactics that made Rome tremble 2,000 years ago are now studied in corporate boardrooms and military academies alike. Because this isn't just ancient warfare, it's a blueprint for turning the impossible into the inevitable. Take his most famous maneuver, the Alpine Crossing. While Rome assumed geography would protect them, Hannibal saw only opportunity. That same audacity drives today's innovators, entrepreneurs who bypass established markets, or startups that rewrite industry rules overnight. Just as Hannibal turned snow and cliffs into weapons, modern disruptors transform obstacles into advantages. Whether it's Silicon Valley giants upending old industries or small nations outmaneuvering superpowers through asymmetric strategies. Then there's the art of psychological dominance. Hannibal didn't just win battles, he weaponized perception, releasing prisoners to spread terror or sparing allies to sow doubt. Fast forward to modern geopolitics, where information wars and economic sanctions often matter more than tanks. Nations like Russia and China employ similar tactics, flooding social media with disinformation or flexing economic leverage to destabilize rivals without firing a shot. Even in business, brands like Apple or Tesla thrive not just on products, but on crafting an aura of inevitability. But perhaps Hannibal's most enduring lesson is adaptability. Stuck in Italy for 15 years with dwindling supplies, he kept reinventing his approach: guerrilla raids, economic warfare, diplomatic isolation. That flexibility mirrors how companies like Netflix pivoted from mailing DVDs to dominating streaming, or how militaries now blend cyber warfare with traditional combat. In an era where change is the only constant, rigidity equals defeat. Yet there's a warning here too. Hannibal's brilliance couldn't compensate for Carthage's lack of long-term vision, a flaw that doomed his campaign. Modern parallels abound: blockbuster ignoring digital shifts or empires overextending themselves. The takeaway: even genius fails without systemic support. So the next time you face a seemingly insurmountable challenge, ask yourself, what would Hannibal do? Not because war and business are identical, but because the principles of daring, deception, and relentless adaptation transcend time. History's greatest underdog didn't just fight an empire, he taught the world how to think differently, and that's a legacy no defeat can erase. Hannibal's march through history isn't just a tale of battles, it's a masterclass in defiance against the impossible. From the frozen cliffs of the Alps to the blood-soaked fields of Cannae, every step of his campaign forced the world to rethink what one determined leader could achieve. Even in failure, he left an indelible mark, proving that victory isn't always about winning battles, but about reshaping the way wars are fought. What makes his story timeless isn't just the scale of his triumphs, but the humanity behind them. Here was a man who outsmarted empires yet couldn't convince his own government to back him fully, who inspired undying loyalty in his troops but saw his homeland falter when it mattered most. His legacy isn't just in the tactics he pioneered, like the double envelopment or psychological warfare, but in the raw audacity that made Rome, the era's superpower, question its own invincibility. Whether you admire his genius or shudder at his ruthlessness, one thing's certain: Hannibal's saga forces us to reckon with the price of greatness. What does it take to stare down an empire and nearly break it? And what does it cost the person who dares? His life reminds us that history's most captivating figures are never purely heroes or villains. They're something far more compelling. They're human. If this journey through Hannibal's most shocking moments gripped you, let's keep the conversation going. Drop a like if you were stunned by his Alpine crossing, or a comment if you think his decision not to march on Rome was his ultimate undoing. And don't forget to subscribe. We've got more deep dives into history's game changers coming your way. After all, the past isn't just a story, it's a mirror. What do you see reflected in Hannibal's war?